It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, the daily podcast covering your New Orleans Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's episode, it's a post-game podcast, so it's all about initial reactions to the New Orleans Saints 17-14 loss to the Baltimore Ravens to open up the preseason. But we all know the final score in the preseason is not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the quarterback battle, what players stood out on offense, what players stood out on defense, who helped themselves, who hurt themselves. We'll talk about that and much more as we roll on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. And as always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, co-managing editor over at CanalStreetChronicles.com, and your Tuesday co-host over in the National Locked On NFL podcast. We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, your team every day. Real quick, family, before we get started, do you have any questions you want to ask about fantasy football? Make sure you're ready for the beginning of the season. Well, we have a live fantasy football show here on the Locked On Podcast Network Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time over on the Locked On NFL YouTube page, so don't miss it. And if you want to get any questions in ahead of time, go ahead and submit them at Locked On Network. All right, let's go ahead and dive into today's episode of Locked On Saints. It's another bonus episode. Post-game podcast is something I want to add to the repertoire this year. So during the regular season, you can pretty much expect to get 6 podcasts throughout, with the exception of like Monday and Thursday night games and stuff like that. So I want to talk a little bit about this matchup. Of course, New Orleans Saints losing this one 17-14 on the back of 6 turnovers, 3 interceptions, 3 fumbles in this game. You had 3 quarterbacks play in this one: Taysom Hill, Jameis Winston, as well as Ian Book. All 3 of them threw an interception. You had 4 running backs get snaps out of the backfield outside of Alex Arma, your fullback, 3 of them getting carries and all 3 of them fumbling. That was Latavius Murray, whose first fumble was in the very first drive, the one and only drive that Taysom Hill really looked comfortable. And then you had Devontae Freeman with a fumble later. And then after a really good day, Tony Jones Jr., unfortunately, with a fumble as well. And several of those came in plus territory in scoring distance. So let's start off with our look at the quarterbacks. Here, the New Orleans Saints playing 3 quarterbacks in this game. As we mentioned a moment ago, they sort of went with a phase 1, 2, and 3 approach that Sean Payton highlighted in his post-game presser after the game. He was very upset about the turnovers, which makes perfect sense. 6 turnovers, doesn't matter if it's preseason, regular season, whatever. You don't want to see that turnover margin that high, that turnover total that high. So both Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill attempting 12 passes in this game. Jameis Winston completed 7 for 96 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Taysom Hill completed 8 of those for 81 yards and no touchdowns and an interception. So the passer rating 51 when it came to Taysom Hill, 77.1 for Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston led 2 touchdown drives, including one where he threw a touchdown on his own to Lil Jordan Humphrey in the backfield. But really the guy that stood out in the other touchdown drive was pretty much all Tony Jones Jr., who ran for like 61 yards in just that 63 yards, I think, in just that one drive. So he was really impressive. 7 carries for 82 yards. That's an average of 11.7 yards per carry, and then had 1 touchdown as well on a big 18-yard run, where he also had like a 28-yard run earlier, a 15-yard run in that same drive. So it was really all about Tony Jones Jr. And in fact, later on, when Jameis Winston did throw a touchdown during that drive, Tony Jones Jr. cracked off 2 big-time blitz pickups that gave Jameis Winston the time to get downfield to Ty Montgomery on one of those passes and then get to the end zone to Little Jordan Humphrey for the touchdown. Over on the defensive side, the pass rush actually looked pretty good. It was an interesting day, though, watching David Onyemata play all over the defensive line. He played on the interior, but he also played on the edge. Sean Payton commented on that after the game. Peyton Turner was not available. Tano Passanio ended up being out after he got hit. He was bloodied all up in the face, probably went through concussion protocol and everything, but they were down in terms of number when it came to edge rushers, so they let David Onyemata have a crack at working off of the edge, and he actually played pretty well from there. But you also saw some good push from guys like Marcus Davenport, Carl Granderson, and of course on the interior with guys like Jalen Dalton and Christian Ringo, both of which had pretty good games. Next level back would be the linebackers. Linebacker depth all of a sudden looks great for the New Orleans Saints. Remember, we came into the beginning of the offseason here talking about how linebacker might be one of the weakest positions because you had DeMario Davis and then nobody else, so you didn't have anybody behind your star player. Now all of a sudden, Quan Alexander, who actually dressed for the game, he was in uniform, but then got out of uniform after the pregame huddle, which several players actually did, including like Teron Armstead, Ryan Ramczyk, and a couple of others. But I think that when you look at these linebackers, a lot of them stood out, particularly Zack Baun, who had a fantastic day. We're going to circle back around to him in the third segment where we talk about defensive standouts. But Caden Ellis had a nice day. Chase Hansen had a couple of good hits. And then going back one more step further to the secondary, Eric Burrell, who we've had here on the podcast before, was out there just laying the boom on people any chance that he got the opportunity. But the secondary player that stood out the most for me, Paulson Adebo, had a really, really great day, and they went after him, which makes sense because he's a rookie. The Ravens did go after him in the passing game, didn't really give up very much. He had one really great play to where he gave up a reception underneath, but immediately crashed down to make the play on it. You saw him make a play out in the flats as well with the help of Zack Baun, who was able to help finish the play. And you also saw Paulson Adebo on a 61-yard punt by Blake Gillikin, who was just phenomenal. He punted 3 times with an average of 47.3 yards per punt. Paulson Adebo got down there, and it was Tylan Wallace for the wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens who was fielding the punt. He muffed the punt, and Paulson Adebo immediately made a tackle for another -2 yards on that one. So just a really, really great day for Paulson Adebo and continuing the trajectory that he set going through camp, getting into this preseason game, now getting to see it in full speed action. And real quick, one more shout out, Marquez Callaway, who doesn't need his stock to go up, but he had a great day, particularly early on. He and Taysom Hill were just in rhythm right away. He had 3 catches in that opening drive for 61 yards. Those accounted for 61 of 62 passing yards in that drive by Taysom Hill. So he was just outstanding, finding holes in the zone. Some very, very nice plays there. When it came to the interceptions in this one, before we get to our second segment here, Taysom Hill's interception was targeting to Ty Montgomery. It looks like he expected Ty Montgomery to continue. Ty Montgomery ended up stopping short, so the ball ended up getting outside and wide of the receiver. For the Jameis Winston interception, he was targeting Lil Jordan Humphrey down the field. He just wasn't able to make the catch. It ended up popping off of him and into the hands of a sliding safety. And then Ian Book's interception came later on where he tried to push the ball downfield down the left sideline to Kawan Baker, also underthrown, and then it was an easy interception for the Baltimore defensive back there. So each quarterback having some fault in their interceptions. Taysom Hill's was probably the least that was maybe on him, just depending upon where the miscommunication was. But I would say that Jameis Winston probably had the better day. He led 2 touchdown drives through the touchdown pass. Just looked really good in and out of the huddle. I still can't say that there was any real split when it comes to, or separation, if you will, when it comes to the quarterback position. So we're still here trying to figure out who's going to be the starting quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. Very little clarity helping out there. So we'll see how it goes as they continue on into the next one. Expect Jameis Winston to get the early first team snaps up against the Jacksonville Jaguars next weekend. All right, coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit more offense. We're going to highlight some players that helped their stock and raise their profiles during this first preseason game as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at betonline.ag. Did you do it? Did you bet on preseason games? How'd that go for you? Let me know. If you did it and it went well for you, please let me know because I want to celebrate you. But if you didn't bet on the preseason games and you don't look forward to betting on any preseason games, don't worry. The regular season's right around the corner. You can already get in on some game of the year action over at betonline.ag. And you can also already look to end of year awards, including MVP, offensive and defensive player of the year, and comeback player of the year as well. That's just the NFL too. There's so much more all across the world of sports that you can find over at betonline.ag. And there are things you can get into outside of the world of sports as well, including reality TV shows, game shows, and award ceremonies as well. So go and check them out at betonline.ag and use the promo code LOCKEDON, LOCKEDON, with your very first deposit so you can get a 50% welcome bonus as you get started. That's a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit with promo code LOCKEDON over at betonline.ag. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. We've talked a little bit and just kind of tried to highlight some of the big pieces. Remember, we're here 5 days a week, so we'll get more in depth with this game on Monday/Tuesday because I'm doing an extra episode this week. So I can't cram it all into one episode, but we also don't need to. We can take our time with all of it. But went ahead, got some of the big highlights out in the first segment. I do want to mention that Michael Thomas was present off to the sideline. Cat Terrell did a phenomenal job asking Sean Payton after practice after the game when Sean Payton was not very happy with those 7 turnovers, and not just the turnovers, but all the penalties as well. If you watch the game, there were a ton of penalties in this one, including a drive that I think it was Ian Book's first drive is an 11-play drive, 3 false start penalties or illegal procedure penalties, if you will, during that drive. It was a little hard to watch and a little hard to stomach, and certainly Sean Payton not very happy about that, but Cat Terrell still coming in with the questions about Michael Thomas in the meeting. And of course, Sean Payton wouldn't elaborate on that, but he did say that that Michael Thomas is happy to be back around the team, that the team is happy to have him around, and that he's happy that Michael Thomas is around. And also mentioned kind of offhand that Michael Thomas is ahead of schedule. Remember, the schedule was 6 to 8 weeks for recovery, 6 to 8 weeks for rehab. So maybe it's looking closer to 6 weeks for at least the recovery process. We don't know about the rehab process yet, but 6 weeks maybe can, help out in getting potentially the all-pro wide receiver back, maybe a little bit earlier, a week or two earlier than anticipated, but we'll see. I don't think they're going to try to rush that at all, but still some good news to hear. All right, so we're going to talk about players that raised their stock on the offensive and defensive side. We'll come back to defense. Let's stick with offense here. And I talked about him already a little bit. Tony Jones Jr., 7 rushes, 82 rushing yards, as well as a touchdown in that one, but he didn't stop at just the run game. And this is where I think he differentiates himself potentially from some other running backs that have gotten some hype on the New Orleans Saints team in previous preseasons. I think we can all very unfondly remember what happened with guys like Boston Scott and, of course, Devine Ezigbo, who had these big preseasons with New Orleans but didn't stick around. I think if you look at the rushing numbers for Tony Jones Jr., that's one thing, but you also take into consideration what I mentioned earlier in terms of his ability as a pass blocker. That was huge for the team and actually led to a passing touchdown because he was able to buy Jameis Winston time for throwing a block on an unblocked receiver otherwise coming off of the right edge. But if you look at the receiving totals as well, Tony Jones Jr. targeted 5 times in this game, caught all 5 of those passes for 38 yards, including a long of 17, averaged 7.6 yards per catch, while also averaging 11 plus yards per carry. So I think with all 3 of those elements of his game on full display in this matchup, that's a really good showing, especially when the 2 running backs ahead of you put the ball on the ground and turned it over, and combined the 2 of them in the run game combined for 11 carries for 12 yards. Latavius Murray, 5 carries for 6 yards with a long of 2. Devontae Freeman, 6 carries for 6 yards with a long of 2. So this was maybe Tony Jones Jr.'s coming out party here. And so we were excited to see that. And he was a player we were excited about last season as well, but didn't get an opportunity to see, spent the entire season on the practice squad. Then we finally got to see him in week 17 in that game where all the running backs were unavailable, but he ended up getting injured early in that one, and it became the Ty Montgomery show. Another player that is a second-year player and had a phenomenal game in this game. Let me not say phenomenal, but he had a great game in this one. Let's be real. He had a 38-yard catch as well as a 32-yard catch, or a 33-yard catch rather, totaling up 71 yards on 2 catches. And that would be Juwan Johnson. We mentioned that he would be one that we wanted to watch and see, and he had not only a couple of nice catches, but yards after catch as well. So it wasn't as simple as him just making a couple of catches and going down and, making some tough catches over the middle. He helped push the ball downfield quite a bit and found some wide open spaces in zone coverage and everything. So you really like what you saw from Juwan Johnson. And obviously all of these quarterbacks are pretty comfortable with Juwan Johnson and had gotten opportunities to work with him. He did have the 4 touchdowns in 2 days during red zone and goal line. So I sort of expected him to maybe catch that same touchdown that we saw to little Jordan Humphrey in the red zone from Jameis Winston. But hey, let's not be picky about who caught the touchdown and just be excited that someone did catch the touchdown. We'll say Lil Jordan Humphrey had himself a nice day as well. He was targeted a total of 5 times, had 3 catches for 29 yards and the touchdown in the end zone. Just want to see him use that frame a little bit more aggressively and just play a little bit stronger. That's really the thing that you want to see from him. All right, so that's over on the offensive side. I'm sure maybe there's some players that you thought also stood out over on the offensive side, certainly on the offensive line early on as well. So if you want to shout out any of those players, let me know on Twitter at Ross Jackson Nola, Nola. And of course, you can comment below if you're watching on YouTube as well. But certainly we'll be talking about more of these players that were either difference makers or that contributed and played well in tomorrow's episode as well as Tuesday's episode after I get my rewatch in. All right, coming up next, we're going to take a look at the defensive side of the ball. Who are the players that stood out over on defense? We got that coming up for you as we wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. And as we continue on with today's post-game episode of Locked On Saints, don't forget that this episode is brought to you in part by our good friends over at Built.com. Particularly want to shout out Built Bars, the best tasting protein bars on the market, the protein bars that taste like a candy bar. I hope you got your Rocky Road order in because, like we always say, they have the limited edition ones and they go quickly. They're already sold out. So I hope you got them. If you got them, let me know. Let me know how you like them. But don't worry, if you didn't get in on Rocky Road, there's still 9 incredible flavors for you to choose from, including coconut, coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, mint brownie, cookies and cream, salted caramel. And I know what you're thinking, like, yo, Ross, that sounds like that is loaded with sugar. And actually, it's low sugar, 4 to 5 grams of sugar, 4 or 5 grams of net carbs as well, even though you're getting 17 or 18 grams of protein, ranging anywhere between 130 to only 180 calories per bar. You got to check these things out if you haven't already. And if you have, go ahead and get your next box as well. And either way, I'm going to help you get 15% off. All you got to do is use the promo code LOCKED15. Doesn't matter if it's your first order or your next order, promo code LOCKED15 is going to get you 15% off over at BuiltBar.com. And with a little bit of that money that you're saving, you might be able to do some nice things to get your car all fixed up. And of course, if you want to do that and not have to spend your entire bank account to do so, one of the best places to check out, the best place to check out is rockauto.com. From the comfort of your own home, get whatever part, piece, or accessory you need for whatever vehicle you drive. Doesn't matter your make, your model, the year, doesn't matter. They're going to have several options for you. The same parts that you're going to be able to get over at the corner stores or the stores around the corner, rather the brick and mortar spots, you're going to be able to get them for much cheaper over at rockauto.com. And again, from the convenience of your own home. So whether you're a do-it-yourselfer or a professional, go and check them out. And don't forget to let them know that Locked On sent you by writing Locked On in the How'd You Hear About Us section. It's rockauto.com. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, and all the parts that your car will ever need. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up this post-game podcast episode of Locked On Saints. Thank you so much, as always, for being here. We had an enormous week last week, so thank you all for all of the support, and I hope that I can just continue to bring you what you're looking for, whether you're taking us in on your favorite podcast provider or you're checking us out on YouTube. I appreciate you, and we're going to continue here 5 days a week at least moving forward here throughout the season. And I would even be comfortable saying 6 episodes a week, probably because of the post-game episodes for the most part. But I do want to talk a little bit now about the defensive players. Let's get back into it. There are a few defensive players that stood out that I thought performed extremely well. A couple of them I've mentioned already, but it doesn't hurt to go a little bit more in detail here. Zack Baun had just a phenomenal game. He was everywhere, all over the place, just making some incredible plays time and time again. I'm going to grab his tackle numbers here. He had 5 total tackles in this one, 3 that were solo, 2 that were combined. He had 1 tackle for a loss and also had a pass defended. He was just kind of all over the place. I mean, and every one of those tackles felt different. Yeah, I guess obviously they all feel different than the other, but these aren't tackles to where somebody was just coming over the middle. He was making tackles in the backfield. He was making tackles in the flat. He was making tackles downfield a little bit. He was making tackles in the middle of the field as well. So he really, really, really impressed me. And he impressed a lot of Saints media as well. We all sort of saw him during camp really sort of come into his own for sure, but we did not expect this to be his first game on the field. And getting I think he probably got more snaps in this game. I'll have to look at the snap counts once they release, but I would almost wager that he got more snaps in this game than he got in the entirety of 2020's regular season. I mean, he just rarely got to see the field because he was in that Sam linebacker spot last year, and the Saints lived in nickel and dime defense, but he really, really outperformed certainly my expectations of him in his first full speed action at this new off-ball linebacker position. But there's a lot to be excited about when it comes to Zack Baun. And even though Quan Alexander is on this roster, they still are going to pay attention to what these young linebackers are going to show. And so you've got Quan Alexander on a 1-year deal, but you've still got Zack Baun on a rookie deal. So if you end up, starting Quan Alexander to start this season, which I would very much expect, you still have your linebackers of the future behind Demario Davis and Quan Alexander to look at in 2022, or heaven forbid if there's any type of injury and, a guy like Zack Baun needs to step in place of Quan Alexander. Another one we've talked about a little bit earlier, Paulson Adebo. He had a really nice day as well. Again, not just in the passing game, but he also made some plays in the short passing game, in the run game, and then, of course, in special teams as well. He had that big special teams tackle as a gunner downfield on the big 61-yard boot from Blake Gillikin. Just a remarkable punt there. He had 3 solo tackles. No, sorry, all 3 of his tackles were combined. And then he also had a special teams tackle and then got in on a couple of passes as well. Really sticky coverage, very physical player. Didn't get flagged for any. Well, actually, sorry, he got flagged for 1 defensive pass interference penalty, but it happened on the same play that there was also a holding penalty on the offense. I would say that the defensive pass interference penalty was a little ticky-tacky, but that might just be a little bit of bias in me because I want to see Paulson Adebo do well. And so, maybe that's just me, but I thought that was more the receiver falling. But regardless, he still had a great game, and they did go after him. I mean, they targeted him in this game. And again, it makes sense because he's a rookie, right? And you've got Trace McSorley, you've got guys like Devin Duvernay that, they're trying to attack downfield. And we saw Devin Duvernay give the business to Ken Crawley on one of those plays, but Ken Crawley still had a pretty nice game as well. But Paulson Adebo really another player that outplayed expectations. And then this guy doesn't really need his stock to go up, but I can't go without talking about his play. It's David Onyemata. They lined him up on the inside. They lined him up out on the edge. They ended up sending him in so many different looks in so many different ways. And he made a ton of plays, whether it be in the run game or in the passing game. He's credited with a sack. But David Onyemata just absolutely dominated wherever it was that the New Orleans Saints put him. And certainly that makes sense, right? The offensive line for the Ravens has not been very strong this offseason. They've been shuffling around like crazy, all before even getting to the preseason. But regardless, you put David Onyemata in there, you expect him to dominate. And that's exactly what he did. First team, second team, third team, doesn't matter. David Onyemata had himself a game. Quick shout out to both Caden Ellis and Eric Burrell, as well as Bryce Thompson as well, who all made big plays. Eric Burrell had a hit on, who was it? Brent Hundley was the quarterback at the time. It was a sack, and he ended up popping the ball out. Caden Ellis getting the recovery there. Caden Ellis also made a couple of nice plays in the run game as well. Struggled a little bit when it came to coverage, but not terrible at all. And so really liked what you saw from both of those guys. And then Bryce Thompson had a big free safety Marcus Williams impression type of interception to where he just got some range underneath him and ended up picking off the ball before it got to the receiver down the left sideline. All right. Those are all of my notes for today. We're going to get way more in depth on this game. Don't worry. But we'll get to that on Monday as well as our Tuesday episode. So I appreciate y'all for being here. On Monday's episode, we're going to break it down a little bit and also take a look ahead to potential cuts. Remember, the New Orleans Saints have to cut 5 players before the 4 p.m. deadline on Tuesday. Wouldn't be surprised to see some of those cuts come a little early, but we'll talk about them. And then, of course, we'll react to them later on down the week. And then come Wednesday, we're already going to be starting to turn our attention to the next matchup the following weekend against the Jacksonville Jaguars. We'll have all of that for you throughout the rest of the week here on Locked On Saints as we get started with a fresh one and continue on. As always, y'all, for everything in between, though, you can find me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. Trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.